Okay, thank you so much for joining us. That was a great presentation from the FBI. And we've got another 25 wonderful experts from all over the globe joining us today at our inaugural official cybersecurity summit, completely virtual. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Not only is she a great cyber expert, she's a friend of mine. It's Nicole Eagan, Chief Strategy Officer and AI Officer of Darktrace. Her extensive career spans over 30 years, starting with Oracle, going up to now Darktrace for the last few years, which is one of the hottest cybersecurity companies in the industry. She's been in the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Fast Company, and countless other media outlets, and has been named top 25 women leaders in cybersecurity. Ladies and gentlemen, we are live with Nicole Eagan. Nicole, can you hear me?
I can, Bradford. Thanks so much.
You got it. Great. I'm going to sign off. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Well, as we saw with all of the global disruption that we've had, it's really been a great opportunity for a lot of companies to accelerate their digital transformation projects. But don't think that this opportunity has been lost on the cyber criminals as well. They have really taken full advantage of the landscape while many of us were home working from our kitchen tables. What I'd like to do is start with some of what we saw, some lessons learned, and some really practical advice. So in terms of what we learned, these are the top types of attacks that our artificial intelligence spotted during the last 90 days. During that period of time, we actually implemented what we call proactive threat notification services. And in those services, we were able to have the AI notify over 4,000 different organizations who are Darktrace customers. And we basically prompted them to be aware of these attacks, but also have the AI, in many cases, do the investigation and remediation. The first thing we saw was a huge spike in what we call out-of-hours activity. And what that means is that I think because employees were working more dynamically, they were working maybe less structured hours, we saw attacks happening all hours of the day and night, and especially weekends, and now that we're into the summer months, even while people might be taking a little bit of much deserved time off. So that out of hours activity, we saw an increase in 9%, but that was combined with something that I think was even a bit more concerning, a 13% increase in large file transfers that were happening during those out of hours. Now, some of that may have been employees just trying to figure out how to get their job done in this new world, but some of it were unusually large file transfers that looked much more like data exfiltration. Ransomware is at epic proportions right now. We have just heard from the FBI and they've covered that extensively, so I'm not going to go into too much depth there. Lateral movement. This, as you see, 2/3 of all alerts that we identified were related to lateral movement. Now, what this means that because there's a lot of new provisioning of IT equipment, there's a lot of new also ways that employers are communicating with their IT organizations. There's been a lot of IT spoofing attacks, and that has enabled some of the bad actors to get a foothold into organizations. And once they do, we're seeing them use fewer malware techniques, and we see instead an increase in what we call living off the land. And that's where you're seeing this lateral movement, where once they get inside, they're starting to go undetected as long as possible, but at some point they will strike. And what we don't know is when they will strike. We do anticipate that we may see a further uptick in activity as people try to start moving back into their offices once again. And the last two I'd like to cover is Saas account hijack. So we've seen obviously a tremendous increase in the number of software as a service and cloud applications being used by remote workers. So probably not surprisingly, we're seeing more account hijacks. Even more concerning, I think, is when we see these attacks on the administrative accounts and configuration settings of these SaaS applications. And then finally, let's not forget that the things that used to make headlines are still out there, and that's the kind of organized criminal gangs that are still up to nefarious activities. And for example, we saw an increase in new banking Trojans that first hit in June in the US and quickly expanded to European banks as well. I mentioned a moment ago about the rapid adoption we've seen of Saas applications, and these are just some quick stats to highlight that. So as you see here, the number of seats, especially of Microsoft 365, things like Microsoft Teams being more heavily relied on, so a tremendous increase there. And what we saw, obviously, was in some of these areas, maybe there wasn't prior technology to really provide ample visibility, ample security. Another example of this would be Zoom. We, of course, are all living on video conferencing apps like Zoom, and this usage of Zoom also opened up new opportunities. In fact, if you're interested, there's a blog on the darktrace.com website that actually talks about how some attackers were able to use Zoom seats as a method of attack. So again, just an environment, and while they've been tremendously increasing their security, may just not be up to the standards that you have across all of your other infrastructure. And so we want to be able to change that and give you consistent security across these environments. In addition to that, obviously mobile apps being increased, but not only for consumer use, but business use. So that being up 90%, increase in G Suite adoption. And I think on the right-hand side, you're going to see here that while all of this is going on, we found that less of 1/3 of all businesses are actually using some type of machine learning monitoring to actually be able to track this behavior. So if there is an account compromise, can you see it? And that's what we want to make sure, is that you've got that visibility. And think about the scale this is happening at. This is going to outstrip human capacity. We need to make sure we've got the AI and machine learning giving you this visibility and being able to not only detect the unusual behavior, but most importantly, to actually be able to stop that attack from happening. So be able to flag that compromise and disable temporarily access to that account. So this brings us to a whole new area. And I mentioned earlier how, this whole disruption was an opportunity for us to accelerate technology roadmaps. And similar to many of you, Darktrace did the same. In fact, we accelerated key technology on R&D roadmap. And we like to refer to this as the Darktrace dynamic workforce. What this is really all about is, as you're trying to move forward and accelerate some of your own digital transformation projects, and you're at the same time trying to cope with the fact that so many of your employees now are working in these fluid environments, right? They're working those flexible hours. Many are still working remotely from home. Some are starting in a very kind of staggered, fragmented way, possibly to return to 1 or 2 days a week in the office. And as we just talked about, you now have to be concerned that while they were maybe disconnected from the VPN off and on while they were working from home, some malware, some vulnerabilities, some use of unapproved technology likely occurred. And now this is going to be reintroduced back into your corporate environment. And we believe that this may prompt this second wave of these low-lying cyber criminals that have been thriving on this disruption to now wreak a bit of havoc as people start with some resemblance of normal or returning to the office. We also know that this is going to take some extended period of time. None of us know for sure, but we could still be living in this very dynamic environment for easily 6 to 12 months or even longer. And some of this, our best practices, they're even here to stay with us. So what we also learned that was quite interesting is that while I think the traditional kind of techniques of things like rules and signature type systems weren't able to keep pace with all of this disruption, all of this change, all of these new evolving threats, we did find that AI-based cyber systems, ones that use this kind of machine learning, especially unsupervised machine learning, it actually was able to learn these new patterns of work. So as employees started working from home, as they started using these new SaaS and communication and collaboration tools that they hadn't used before, the machine learning was able to learn what we call their new pattern of life, or in this case, their new pattern of work. And that made all the difference. It meant that we didn't have to rely on people going in and changing the rules or creating new rules that reflected these new work patterns. the machine learning automatically in real time adjusted to understand these new patterns. And quite frankly, that's what enabled us to keep those 4,000 organizations I mentioned at the top of the presentation safe during all of this transition. So I'm going to talk in a few minutes a little bit more about how you can use machine learning and AI to better automate, but more importantly, to augment your human security teams. So the first thing that we did accelerate on our roadmap was this whole area of cyber AI for the dynamic workforce. So the way I think of this is just you need to be able to have this kind of dynamic, real-time, adaptable security wherever your employees are working. And so let's talk about where are they working? Well, they're obviously working on endpoints. So they've got their laptops, their mobile devices. They're living more than ever in email. And then finally in those Saas environments, which you see a number of them on the screen here, right? The Zooms, the Salesforce.coms, the Microsoft 365, the Teams applications. So that is what we accelerated on our roadmap. So people traditionally had known Darktrace for doing a great job, maybe covering their infrastructure, whether that be on-premise with networks or in the cloud. But now we needed to give you that same high level of visibility and consistent security everywhere. So what this means is that now you can actually see when somebody is disconnected from VPN, get a contextual understanding of what they're doing, see when then they pop into a SaaS application, when they're then targeted by a phishing attack. And you can use one technology to do all of this. So it's all the same underlying machine learning. It's just basically operating on multiple data types that are located wherever employees are doing the work. What it also means is you can detect these very difficult to detect threats. Things like the account takeovers, malicious insiders, whether it be, by the way, malicious or inadvertent, and things like critical configuration errors. Also, all those things I talked about earlier, things like that lateral movement that is so very important. I mentioned email earlier, and I think many times when I have a conversation, you know, email is still very high on the list of what companies are trying to protect against. And part of that is that the email attackers have started to learn how to maybe work cleverly around some of the traditional email gateway systems. And so there's a whole new emerging category of email security solutions, and they are predicated now on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So why is this important, and why is it better, or maybe also an incremental kind of coexistence with some of the email gateways that you've already deployed? Well, the way I like to think about it is what the AI can actually do is, rather than maintain all of these lists of known good and known bad, those lists have to be maintained by people. Human beings have to update those lists. And what we saw, for example, at the beginning of COVID was the number of new domains that were registered, hundreds of thousands of new domains registered in the first few weeks of COVID, that were trying to pretend they were the CDC or others. And it was impossible for humans to update those known good and known bad lists fast enough to keep pace. And it was also taking a lot of time. Sometimes I talk to security teams and they're saying there's 1 to 2 people that are spending most of their time trying to update these domain lists. So what also happens, there was social engineering attacks, more clever attacks that the mail gateways are just not catching. The ones that, for example, we had one that we caught recently, it targeted a trio. It targeted a member of the board of directors, the CEO, and the CFO with a very targeted, very clever social engineering attack that luckily the AI was able to detect and stop in its tracks. But these type of attacks often go missed. So how does the AI do this, and how does it catch these more subtle, sophisticated attacks? Well, what the AI does is it learns who should be emailing me and who shouldn't, right? And it does that for every employee in your organization. It also gets contextual understanding. Was this email crafted or written in a way consistent with the language that person uses? Was it maybe asking for something like money? So the AI can actually learn all of that, detect it, and distinguish between good and bad automatically. So I really urge you to at least take a look at this new category of AI-based email solutions, because they work very differently than the traditional way. This is actually an area that we spent 3.5 years doing research and development on. It's, I think, one of a kind in the market. We refer to it as a cyber AI analyst. It's probably the most significant way to save your human security team time. And again, it's one that I think once you and your team starts using it, you're probably going to be hooked on it, because it saves about 92% of the human team's time on investigating threats. And I think one of the things that we've always heard about is alert fatigue, and the fact that you've got all these different systems looking at different parts of your environment, sending off these alerts. And maybe one of the biggest challenges is for the human security team to figure out where to spend their time. What are the priorities? And how do they make sure that they didn't miss one of those alerts that didn't look so concerning, but turned out to be down the road something very alarming? So what the AI analyst does is it actually does the investigation. And not only does it investigate the high priority threats, it investigates 100% of all of the alerts that fall into these threat trays. And it does it behind the scenes. And once it does a complete investigation, which, by the way, at the pace and speed of AI, it can go very quickly in the background, it actually then prioritizing only those that are meaningful for a human to investigate. It really mimics a human threat analyst. It goes out and looks at all different data sources. It does the investigation. It even writes the report in executive human-friendly language. It even tells you what attack phase and attack methods were used. So AI analysts, I think, we've heard about AI for a while, obviously detecting threats, and Darktrace has been doing that for about 7 years now. But this idea of actually using the AI to investigate what only humans can do before, that is really revolutionary. That leads me to another area. We talked about how ransomware and out-of-hours attacks are an all-time high right now. And what that means is that you want the ability for machine learning or AI to actually not only spot the attack when it's happening at 3 a.m., but to slow it down, to buy your human team time, to keep all of that data from being encrypted. And that's exactly this category called autonomous response technology. So autonomous response technology can work in a number of places. It can work in your network, it can work in your cloud, it can work in your email, it can work in those Saas environments. The real premise of it is the same. It's allowing the machine learning, based on the data it has at hand, to make split-second decisions about what actions can be taken to minimize any operational outage or reputational damage from a threat. And what it's programmed actually to do from a machine learning perspective is the first thing it does is it figures out how to minimize operational outages. So many times I hear people saying, oh, I would be afraid to let the machine learning take an action. Well, what if that action is actually to build in resiliency, to actually keep the operational systems running while under attack? That is a very different approach than taking things offline. So this whole category of autonomous response, again, you can't live without it in areas like email, cloud, Saas, where just the volume of data and the speed of what can happen is just way too fast. So this is an area that, again, I prompt people to look at. We have well over 50% of Darktrace customers using autonomous response day in, day out. You can actually run it in what's called human confirmation mode. And people usually do that for a few months to see what actions it will take. And then eventually they go live with it, or at least for out-of-hours attacks and things like ransomware. So what this brings us to is, this whole idea that you traditionally have covered probably extremely well your infrastructure, right? And so that's making sure that all of your on-prem networks, your cloud infrastructure, your IoT, your factory floors, that all needs to be covered. And that has been a traditional area for Darktrace to partner with companies like yours to be able to provide this enterprise immune system to keep that infrastructure safe. But now, as you see on the left-hand side, the workforce has become more dynamic, more fluid, more important than ever to cover, whether they're working remotely or whether they're coming back and forth into the office. Protecting that workforce at the endpoint with the email systems, with the Saas applications, that is all really important. Integrating to things like zero trust environments. That's another area that we accelerated on our development roadmap. So bringing those worlds of zero trust together with this immune system approach. And then being able to not only take actions, but to be an AI brain that can actually coordinate strategic responses by integrating with other different security tools you already have deployed in line. Things like firewalls, things like existing agents and antivirus and technologies on endpoints, integrating, of course, with your SIM or your analytics tools, security analytics tools like Splunk, and even integrating into your SOC workflow with things like Jira and ServiceNow. So this is kind of a holistic picture and approach where this allows you to use this machine learning technology to get a very high level of consistent security across your entire digital estate. And so with that, Bradford, I'm more than open to take any questions that you or the audience may have.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Let me see what we have here. Well, kind of a generic one, and actually for myself as well, since I'm the only one here at the office today. You know, no one's really returning because everyone's afraid to come back to the New York City offices. But you know, for companies looking to move back to the office, is there any specific advice that you would give? Any certain steps, protocols?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few. I mean, most everyone does have some level of protection on the endpoint, but what we remain concerned about is some of the techniques that were used to take advantage of people as they went off of VPN, or maybe were connecting, you know, obviously everyone's connecting through things like home Wi-Fi. Right. And it's just hard to protect against all of that, and especially if it's not your kind of traditional malware style attacks. So, you know, our advice, I guess, is make sure that you, in an ideal world, I'd say that you have some visibility into what's happened while that user's been working from home, so that you understand what's already been possibly deployed or who might already be lurking in background processes of those machines before they reconnect up back into the workplace. So that, I think, is, you know, the first thing is making sure you've got that kind of visibility. I think the other thing is, I just mentioned zero trust, making sure that you're integrating, if you have deployed zero trust, that you're integrating your other security tools like your Darktrace environments into your zero trust environments. And I know zero trust has really been high on many companies' lists during this. And then finally, those, you know, are you protecting the things we just talked about? Are you protecting Zoom? Are you protecting Teams? Are you protecting all of those SaaS applications? And we found, as you saw in the statistics earlier, that a third of companies aren't. They aren't doing anything extra to give them protection and visibility into those environments. And as we know, attackers will always look for the weakest link as a way to get in. And we do see a number of, you know, these account, you know, hijacks or account takeovers fall victim to that. So those are just some of the basics that, you know, we're advising people put in place before people start returning.
You know, Google just announced, I think it was yesterday, that their employees don't even have to come back to work for another year. So that plus the resurgence leads me to almost a rewind question. People may go back to the office, but then may be asked to stay home again. How does your Darktrace solution work with like your home router that's given to you by your cable network? Because that's where most people are now working. 70–80% of the workforce, people are relying on their home front. Is your solution, is it the same style as it, you know, as it would be in a commercial environment? Meaning that if you're only as good as the cable box, the cable company's $10 router, how can Darktrace protect the 80% of the workforce that's now at home?
Exactly. And that was what was really interesting as people first, literally overnight moved to their home offices.
Right.
Um, we got to see our machine learning in action and see how it adjusted to that, right? And so it was interesting is the way the machine learning works is it doesn't care what network you're connecting to. It could care less if it's a home Wi-Fi router or if it's, a corporate environment or if it's a cloud. And I think that's one of the beauties of it is it literally doesn't care where the data is coming from.
Just monitors the whole network.
Yeah, it looks at all of it. It worked brilliantly, quite frankly, because it started learning that, oh, wow, okay, Nicole's connecting now through her home Wi-Fi router and she's all of a sudden using Zoom. She never used Zoom before. It learned my new pattern of life immediately and dynamically. And, our security and IT team didn't have to tell it anything. We didn't have to reconfigure any settings. Okay. It just learned automatically that I had traffic coming from a different place. I was connecting differently. I was using different tools, and It kept me safe. And it was able to compare how I was working with other Darktrace employees. I'm using Darktrace as an example, but that's pretty much how it worked across all 4,000 of our customers. It automatically learned that new pattern. And so I think that's one of maybe the unspoken strengths that, we and others didn't talk about before with this unsupervised machine learning. Sure. It learns, we always said it learns the pattern of life, but maybe it's not only learning the pattern of life, it literally is learning the pattern of work. And it learns it quickly. I think that's the other part. It literally, relearns on a dime. And that was really critical.
As long as it doesn't shut down my daughter's TikTok, then we're
that's a whole different issue. But yeah, but your point's well taken, which is we're going to be in this for a while, and we're going to see, people going into the office here and now, depending on their location, day of the week, people's staggered work schedule, and then other environments, as you said, there are a number of companies saying, hey, it's working well the way we are. Maybe we don't need to go back to the office, or at least for a long while. Sure. So I think, having this kind of machine learning that adapts to this constantly changing environment gave machine learning a whole new value proposition, quite frankly.
Sure. Here's another one. We've asked this when you've been at our summits live, and I certainly missed them. Hopefully we'll be back in 2021, probably now later in the year. But what happens if an attacker is already on the network prior to inserting the Darktrace solution? Is it going to get found out? Is it going to get picked up?
Yeah, absolutely. And quite frankly, that's a very common scenario. In fact, we run these 30-day proof of values. And one of the things that we find is that in about 98 to 99% of the proof of values, there is already something inside. Now, whether that's maybe a bit of a malicious insider snooping around or moving large files, or whether that's some malware that's dormantly sitting in the environment, it is the case that the majority of times, most networks are not 100%, or not networks, clouds, email systems, they're not all squeaky clean. And so you're going to see things that are already there. And what the machine learning is smart enough to do is it actually can use a lot of techniques like clustering techniques to actually see that behavior still stands out amongst the rest. All of a sudden, that dormant attacker is going to have to do some kind of lateral movement or do something out of the ordinary to snoop around to find what they're looking for, or to do some damage. And so the immune system technology will detect that, even if it existed before we deployed.
Okay, excellent. Well, always fascinating, and I always learn a little bit more when I hear you speak. I think we're just about at a time, and hopefully we can allow, there's hundreds of people, thank God, that are with us, which is nice. So they could visit your experts at the Darktrace virtual booth. So I invite all those people online that have any additional questions for Darktrace or for any of our solution providers to just kind of go to our virtual exhibit hall, click on it, and they can live chat with you and your team. And Nicole, I know you're a very busy person. Thank you so much for joining us again. And
thanks for having us, Bradford. And it's great to hear that we've got hundreds of people joining us today live.
And no one dropped off when you were speaking, so we're good.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Nicole, take care, and hopefully I'll see you live one of these days.
Perfect. Take care.
You got it. Okay, folks, thank you, Nicole, again. we've got a little bit of a break. You could visit our virtual exhibit hall, check out some solutions from Darktrace and the 30 other cyber solution companies that are with us today. And then we'll be back with our next expert very, very soon. Thanks.